Hello and welcome to the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. I'm Mark Rees, and on each episode, I investigate a different, weird, and wonderful subject. And on this episode, we are going to look at a good old haunted castle. A haunted castle with all of the classic ghosts that you might expect to find there, as well as one that you might not. And that is the headless spirit of Wales's first warrior princess. Yes, Wales's first warrior princess, not to be confused with Xena, who was a totally different warrior princess. And also, we'll be looking at some more recent ghost sightings, some less folkloric sightings that you might describe as more believable and therefore more likely to send a chill down your spine. But that's enough build-up, enough preamble. Let's dive straight into the history and the ghost stories. And so, to begin, at the beginning. And the haunted castle in question is Kidwelly Castle, a romantic ruin in the Carmarthenshire town of the same name. Kidwelly Castle, which overlooks the flowing waters of the river Gwenllian, Avon Gwenllian. And nowadays it's an idyllic spot, but historically this wasn't always the case. This was the scene of many a bloody skirmish between the native Welsh and the invading Normans. This really is a historical site, and there's been a castle in this location since the 12th century. But as with so many other Welsh castles, or so many other Welsh castles that are still standing today, it was rebuilt in the 13th century of sturdier stuff. And the reason this spot was chosen wasn't for aesthetic reasons, but back then for strategic reasons. Kidwelly Castle was built there because it provided an excellent vantage point over the surrounding landscape, allowing its defenders to spot any enemies well before they reached the castle, and it also gave them access to the water below. But our first tale, which led to the gruesome death of Wales's first warrior princess, does take us back to the 12th century, during what became known as the Great Revolt of 1136, a massive uprising against the Norman rule led by Gwenllian, Ferch Gruffydd. Gwenllian, daughter of Gruffydd ap Cynan, who was a prominent Welsh ruler. She was the one who led a spirited, though ultimately futile, rebellion against the Normans. And futile really is an apt word here. It was desperate. They had next to no chance of winning this fight, but they had to stand up for themselves. They had to attack. And these people, while they were fiercely proud, they were so poorly equipped. They were so outmatched. They were so outnumbered. And their enemy, Gwenllian's enemy, the Norman master of Kidwelly Castle, who'd been given the castle by the English crown, was the opposite. He was a ruthless military leader. He was a skilled opponent with highly organised forces. They were battle-hardened, they were well-supplied, and they were very, very experienced in the more brutal tactics of war. And yet, for Gwenllian, fighting was the only option. Her husband, Gruffydd ap Rhys, was in the north of the country at the time, trying to rally forces to take on the Normans. And this is when they decided to seize the moment and attack. And when Gwenllian caught wind of this, she had no choice but to assemble an army out of anyone and everyone and take the fight to them. She hastily again is a very apt word here. People just grabbed whatever weapons, whatever armor, whatever tools they could find lying around, anything that they could use to attack the enemy with. Her family joined in. Her 2 teenage sons were alongside her. And the attitude was, even if we can't win this, we are going to take as many of them with us as we can. And that's exactly what they did. This brave group of fighters stood up, fought back, but nevertheless were very quickly crushed. Gwenllian was captured, and to make a show of things, maybe to quell any other future thoughts of rebellion, she was publicly executed in a field outside of the castle, which became known as Maes Gwenllian, the Field of Gwenllian. And this public execution saw her head severed from her body. And according to local folklore, a spring of water appeared where her body fell. Nowadays, while I can't confirm or deny the truth about the spring, there is a memorial stone to Gwenllian outside the castle's great gatehouse. A wonderful monument. Stone doesn't really do it justice. I mean, it's not some pebble on the floor, but it's not Stonehenge either. But it's somewhere between Stonehenge and a pebble, which is possibly the worst description I've ever given on this podcast. But if you can imagine a tall rectangular stand-in stone, it's on a circular slate base, which in itself is quite artistic. These smaller stones leading up to and lifting up this memorial stone. And on the front of it is an etching of a circle, inside of which is this intricate Celtic knot that's been inscribed, which I hope is a better description than somewhere between a pebble and Stonehenge. If you still can't picture it, it might be best to do an internet image search, or you could even pick up my book, Paranormal Wales, because I'm pretty sure I included a photo in it. Well, I certainly included some photos of Kidwelly Castle. I'm not entirely sure if the stone is in it or not. But anyway, that's enough. That's my shameless plug over with. Let's move forward through the centuries, because this tale of Gwenllian lingers and mutates and evolves with time. And since those days of turbulent war and rebellion, people have reported again and again seeing, as you already know, a decapitated entity, which is a fancy way of saying a headless ghost walking around this area at night. Now, in 1909, a description of this entity was published. She was described as being, well, firstly, as a she. This is assumed to be a female spirit, dressed in grey, with a long, trailing robe, a girdle, and a hood under which is concealed her missing head, which is a description that poses some questions to me. I'm sure it poses some questions to you too, but if this is indeed a headless ghost with its hood up to conceal its missing head, how do we know that the head is missing? Because we can't see underneath the hood. And in a more practical sense, and I appreciate we're talking about headless ghosts, which aren't the most practical things in the world, but from a practical perspective, if a headless ghost does not have a head, how does it keep the hood upright? I mean, if you try this with a hoodie and you have no head and you pull the hood up over your non-head, it would just fall down again, I am assuming. So what's keeping this hood up? Well, if that wasn't enough questions to keep you lying awake at night trying to solve them, we have further information about this headless ghost's hood and non-head, because an old Carmarthenshire man, we're told, was able to engage this spirit in conversation. And I'll repeat that, engage her in conversation. He spoke with the headless ghost. And again, I am sure you can see where my line of questioning is going with this one. And again, I don't want to be too literal because we are talking about headless ghosts. But how did she speak without a head? Well, sadly, that part isn't explained either. However, the conversation was recorded, and it went like this. He said, "What do you want?" So no messing around with pleasantries for this old Carmarthenshire man, straight to the point. "What do you want?" To which she replied, "Alas, I cannot rest until I find my head. Help me to search for it. Alas, I cannot rest until I find my head. Help me to search for it." And he did. He might have been blunt, but he wasn't unkind. And he began to look. I mean, this account is quite low on details. I don't know if he asked more questions first, like, let's retrace your steps. When did you last see it? Is it by the front door next to the car keys? All we know is that he agreed to look for it, and he spent the next hour trawling around the Carmarthenshire countryside in the dark, looking for this poor woman's head. And when he was unsuccessful, returned on 3 consecutive nights. 3 consecutive nights. He was nothing if not committed or stubborn or terrified maybe, but for whatever reason, he returned, and on the 3rd of those 3 consecutive nights, he found not quite a skull. He found a stone, but a stone which resembled a human skull in shape and size. So we're back to stones again, but don't worry, I'm not going to go off on some weird description. This one was head-shaped, we are told, and similarly sized to a skull. And he handed this to the Headless ghost, who, we are told, concealed it under her robe and hastened away. So this had done the trick by the looks of it. It had worked. It had laid the ghost, as it were. And again, it's a bit hazy on details, but I'm assuming this ghost either thought this'll make a great replacement, I can put it in place of my head and maybe no one will notice the difference, or maybe he just played a trick on somebody who couldn't see what they were being handed. Sadly, again, light on details. And I've spoken before on this podcast about the curse of the author, which is when you write a book and the second your publisher presses print on it, you've gone beyond the point of no return. That book is now out in the world. Something happens to make that book suddenly out of date. And I can remember when I finished writing Paranormal Wales, and I promise that's the last shameless plug for the episode, but I was talking to someone from Kidwelly, a Kidwelly native, soon afterwards, and he said to me, well, I'm assuming you've put Kidwelly Castle in the book. And I said, well, yes, of course I have. How could I leave out Kidwelly Castle? To which he replied, good, so you know all about the tree then? To which I replied, no. I don't know a darn thing about the tree. Tell me about the tree. But apparently, if you're a local, if you're in the know in Kidwelly, there is a specific tree underneath of which is where the skull was buried. So, if the old Carmarthenshire man had known this, it might have saved him a lot of time crawling around in the dark looking for this head. He could have gone straight for the tree and dug it up. And that is certainly something I will be adding to any updated future editions of Paranormal Wales if and when I get the chance. Now, while this account from the early 1900s tells us that this stone seemingly laid the ghost, if reports are to be believed, this is not the case. A headless ghost is still sighted in the area to this day. I've spoken to people in the last year who know a friend of a friend that has seen this ghost. So by all accounts, it is still in the area. But she isn't the only spectral woman said to be haunting this part of Carmarthenshire. There's an unrelated story of another spectral woman, this time with a head, as far as I know, which I'll mention quickly here. I'll go into this in more detail on a future episode. Actually, I might even have recorded an episode in the past about this. I lose track, but hopefully if I have, and you're listening, you've also lost track. But I'd like to mention it here because it does tie in nicely with that story of Kidwelly Castle. And this story concerns a bridge called Pont y Gwendraith. Pont y Gwendraith, which means the bridge over the Gwendraith, that flowing river that the castle overlooks that I mentioned earlier. And this bridge has a rather ominous nickname, which is Pont y Ysbryd, which, again, is Welsh language, and Welsh language speakers will already know what this means. They'll already have the hairs on the back of their neck standing on end, because Pont y Ysbryd means the ghost bridge. Yes, the ghost bridge, which frankly is a bit of a giveaway. Which of these bridges is haunted? Maybe it's Pont y Ysbryd. But I'm getting ahead of myself slightly. This bridge is not haunted at the start of our story. And it was in the late 13th century that Lady Nest, the daughter of the Lord of Kidwelly, got herself mixed up in a rather convoluted love triangle. She and her cousin Gladys had both fallen in love with the knight Sir Walter Mansell. But Sir Walter Mansell only had eyes for Nest. Good news for Nest, bad news for Gladys. And in a fit of jealousy, Gladys arranged for her foster brother, a scoundrel, we are told, called Merrig Maneg, to murder the knight who had turned her down. And so one night, he laid in wait near the bridge. Yes, the ghost bridge. I don't know, I'm assuming it wasn't called the ghost bridge at this point, but he laid in wait near the ghost bridge, where the pair were known to have arranged to meet for a little secret rendezvous. And it was there that he caught them unawares and shot Sir Walter with an arrow, and then flung his dying body over the edge of the bridge into the crashing waters of the Gwenllian. And Nest, without stopping to think of her own safety, automatically leaped in after him, and they both died and their bodies were both washed out to sea. As a result, it is said that both Gladys and Maneg were haunted by Nest for the rest of their lives. And a veiled lady who has been seen appearing and disappearing, always a giveaway that somebody might not be of this earth, appearing and disappearing on and around the bridge, is thought to be her restless spirit who is still seen today. If that wasn't enough, she occasionally lets out a high-pitched wail like an Irish banshee, or, as we have here in Wales, the Grach Aribin, hag of the night, that also lets out a terrifying sound, as does the Cahiraith, which I recorded an episode about quite recently. And this wail is said to signify, as with most ghostly sightings in Wales, the imminent death of somebody known to the person who hears it or the person themselves. As regular listeners will know, there is nothing the Welsh love more than a good old death omen, and this wail that emanates from this veiled woman who died in the waters of the Gwenllian now signals the death of some unsuspecting soul. Which, frankly, is a second very good reason not to be walking around this area late at night. If the Headless lady wasn't enough to put you off, maybe the veiled lady will. But to wrap things up, we're going to look at some more recent sightings, because we started all the way back in the 12th century, but coming forward to 2016, which is fantastically recent for this podcast, it's practically yesterday. But in 2016, the ghosts of Kidwelly Castle made the headlines when a shadowy figure, to quote, was caught on camera by a visitor. And this shadowy figure appeared to be peering out from behind the doors of the great gatehouse, which I mentioned earlier. This is where Gwenllian's stone, her monument, can be found. Now, the reason this particular incident made the news is because there was a photo to support it. And while I can't confirm or deny the validity of this particular photo, what I can say is that shadowy figures have long been reported in this castle, so it isn't that out of the question. Further, people have long assumed, I guess is the best word, that these are medieval soldiers. If for no other reason, then they are the kind of people who would have occupied this castle back in the day, and their silhouettes do look like they're wearing armour, so it all kind of fits together. And if that wasn't enough, in one of the prison cells, or former prison cells now, screaming and yelling have been heard. Again, there's some parallels here with the last ghost I spoke of, although I don't think it's a death omen this time. It simply sounds like a spirit screaming out in pain, wailing and moaning for eternity maybe, in Kidwelly Castle. And to bring things right up to date, and I mean 2025 up to date, this is as topical and as current as I've ever been, but I spoke to a group of investigators who were there not to go looking for these shadows inside, rather they were doing experiments outside, and I won't go into all the technical details right now. I don't want to bog this down with jargon and things, but effectively they were trying to sense if there was some kind of aura maybe coming from the stones themselves. People familiar with the stone tape idea, which I've spoken about before, will maybe understand this idea of maybe castle walls in some way trapping some energy. And this is something they were trying to measure from the outside of the castle. And two people involved in this said on separate occasions that as they were standing there in the daytime, I should add, doing their investigation, they felt a strong shove in the lower back that nearly pushed the two of them over at separate occasions, totally separate times. Now, whatever did this certainly seemed to be invisible. It wasn't one of their friends in a rush to get to the pub or anything. It was something invisible, be it these shadowy soldiers, be it the headless lady, be it the headed lady, whatever it might be. They both reported being shoved in the lower back and had to stop themselves from falling over. And that, I think, is a suitably chilling place with which to end this episode. That brings us to the end of our time-travelling exploration into Kidwelly Castle. And so ends another episode of the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you haven't already, please consider pressing the subscribe button. And if you really enjoyed it, you can support the podcast by rating it, reviewing it, and telling all your friends about it. It all helps. And if you really, really enjoyed it and you'd like to support it going forward, you can treat me to a coffee via my website, which is always very much appreciated and goes towards keeping this thing on the air. If you'd like more Ghosts and Folklore, you can follow me on social media. And as well as this podcast, I've also written a number of books about similar weird and wonderful subjects, as you already know, because I shamelessly name-dropped Paranormal Wales throughout this episode, but that's just one of, there's more than 10 of them now, but Paranormal Wales is the one with Kidwelly Castle in, if that's what you're interested in. And on that final, shameless, self-publicising note, it just leaves me to say, thank you very much for listening. Diolch yn fawr iawn am wrando. I've been Mark Rees. This has been my Ghosts and Folklore podcast, beaming to you from Wales to the world. And remember, if a headless young lady ever asks you to help to find her head, it's only polite to offer assistance. But unlike that old man in Carmarthenshire, be sure to ask one important question first. My good lady, if you have no head, what the heck is keeping that hood upright? Until next time, no star.